Hello, everyone. Welcome to our NANAS Intersectional Age Studies seminar series. My name is Dr. Julia Henderson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of British Columbia, and I'm co-chair of Community Engagement and Intersection with Edwin S.H. Leong Center for Healthy Aging, who is co-sponsoring this seminar series and supporting our tech. And I am a NANAS member and former chair of NANAS. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia's Edwin S.H. Leong Center for Healthy Aging is located in what settlers refer to as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded stolen lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And I'm honored to live, work, and learn on these lands. As this is a virtual seminar, we have people joining from many locations around the country, across Turtle Island, and even around the world. So from coast to coast to coast and beyond, I acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call these lands their home. And we are deeply grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways over centuries, and we commit to moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation and respect. So I'd now like to turn things over to Dr. Corinne Field, Chair and Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Virginia, and co-chair of the NANAS Anti-Racism and Anti-Discrimination Task Force, who will introduce our first speaker.
Hi, thank you for that, Julia, and thank you to Huan for helping me organize this. And I'm so glad that you're all here today. We have a new initiative to spotlight cutting edge, groundbreaking research in intersectional age studies through 3-minute thesis presentations by graduate students. And today it is my absolute delight to introduce to you Juanita Crider. Juanita Crider is the assistant director and an instructor in women's gender and sexuality studies and a doctoral candidate in American studies at Purdue University. Her research focuses on representations of aging and elder Black women in contemporary Black feminist literature, film, television, and visual culture, with particular attention to depictions of menopause and elder sexuality. Her dissertation examines Black feminist narratives of menopause across literature, film, television, celebrity interviews, and new media, analyzing how Black women employ feminist strategies to interpret and challenge the cultural meanings of menopause. She holds a BS in History from Ball State University and an MA in American Studies from Purdue University, and a graduate certificate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I'm so delighted that she's going to be presenting to you on her current research.
Thank you, everyone. I'm a little nervous, but I'll be fine. Menopause is usually framed as an ending or the end of fertility or the beginning of a decline in a time when women are supposed to become quieter and virtually invisible. But my dissertation I came to this research with the purpose of exploring a different question. What if for Black women, menopause is a second coming of age? And so my research examines how Black women prepare for, navigate, and strategize through perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. I focus not so much on the physical symptoms, although you can't help but encounter those and talk about them. I'm looking at more the emotional shifts and often the spiritual reorientations that happen in this season of life. And I argue that these experiences are not just medical or individual, but they are shaped by race, obviously gender, class, and age, and also by the long histories of Black women's survival and creativity. To make sense of this, I turn to Black feminism. These traditions Black feminism gives us a language for intersectionality, for the embodied effects of racism and sexism, and for the importance of community, spirituality, and self-definition. And most of the women that I have encountered on readings that I do, they don't call themselves feminists. However, I argue that they do not have to because of the ways they question, interpret, and reimagine their lives during menopause, that they are doing the work that this theory actually describes, even though they might not label themselves as feminists. And I define theory in my work in a very specific way, not as some kind of abstract jargon, but as the tools that Black women use to ask questions about their bodies, to explore what is happening to them, and to understand their experiences. I pay attention to what Barbara Christian would call theorizing through stories, conversations, jokes, proverbs, just everyday language. It's like menopause talk, you know, at the kitchen table, more or less. How they talk about it in church and group chats and doctors' offices. And I look at that as a key site, those sites as locations of Black feminist thinking and thought and theory. And my project is guided by questions like, does aging change how Black women relate to feminism, even if they never use that word? How do novels and films and television shows portray menopausal Black women and their strategies during this transition? And how do women's daily lives at work, at home, and in community show the ways that they resist and rework and reimagine constraints of age and class, race, and gender? And by tracing these narratives across 3 stages of the perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, I ask whether there is a continuity in how women theorize this transition over time. Do the strategies they develop in one phase build on what came before? Do they arrive at new forms of clarity, agency, or even spiritual insight? It's probably not surprising to you that there's still very little, almost no scholarship that centers Black women's menopause experiences, their coping strategies, or their knowledge. And my dissertation responds to that gap by moving age and menopause from the margins to the center of Black feminist thought. And I also hope that it's also considered as a part of reproductive justice. I argue that menopausal Black women are not only living through change, they are actually producing Black feminist theory as they interpret their symptoms, as they craft new stories about themselves, and share those stories with others. In treating menopause as a second coming of age, my work hopefully reframes this life stage as a powerful site of reawakening, reimagining, and knowledge making for Black women. Thank you.
So, Anita, you're going to introduce Dr. Pittman, right?
Okay. Yes, I am. Are you ready? Okay. Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman is an associate professor of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she holds an appointment in sociology. She serves as the Jeff Hanaway Honors Professor in Western Civilization and brings a deep commitment to examining how systems of race, gender, and family intersect in everyday life. Dr. Pittman is the author of Grandmothering While Black, a 21st century story of love, Coercion and Survival, published by the University of California Press. Her book explores the complex experiences of Black grandmothers raising their grandchildren in what scholars call skipped generation households, homes where parents are absent. Through years of interviews and community engagement, Dr. Pittman illuminates how these grandmothers shoulder caregiving out of both love and necessity, negotiating state systems that often overlook and constrain their labor. Her scholarship reaches far beyond academia. Dr. Pittman's insights have appeared in USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, PBS's To the Contrary, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, and Early Learning Nation, along with organizations such as Generations United and the National Caucus and Center on Black Aging. Her research has been funded by a wide range of fellowships and grants, among them the ACLS Digital Justice Grant, the Cambia Health Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Ford Foundation's National Poverty Center. Dr. Pittman also leads 2 pioneering digital humanities initiatives, the Black Grandmother Archive and the Black Grandmother World Making Library. Through these projects, she works to repair and reclaim how we understand Black grandmothers, preserving their stories, voices, and cultural legacies for future generations. Her talk today, Grandmothering While Black, a 21st Century Story of Love, Coercion, and Survival, foregrounds the voices of the women at the heart of her research. She will explore how contemporary Black grandmothers' caregiving differs from historical patterns, how they navigate legal and bureaucratic pressures, and how they continue through love and resilience to hold families and communities together against profound structural challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Juanita. And yay on your work. So important. I absolutely look forward to being in conversation with you about it. We need that work. I also want to just start by thanking Corey Fields, Dr. Fields, for the invitation to speak today. Super excited to learn about this network and to now become involved in what NANAS is up to. I also want to thank Julia Hernandez, Poon Lee, and Juanita, were you, for organizing this talk and this initiative. I know how much goes into work like this, so thank you all for your labor and contributions. I've spent nearly 2 decades, I'm starting to feel a little old saying that, researching and advocating on behalf of grand families or skip generation households. So families where it's the grandparent and grandchild generation and the parent generation, I like to say is not uh, absent, they're not living in the home. They're often present either in and out or symbolically, even if they're no longer on the planet. First, as a graduate student, working on my dissertation turned book, uh, as a postdoctoral fellow, but also being someone really committed to not just studying what I'm up these topics, but also having some kind of positive impact around sort of policy circles. And then every place that I've been involved with kinship support groups that provide resources and refuge, as well as nonprofit organizations that provide direct service. And so the pictures that you're going to see on my slides are from my years of working in various cities around this population. So, and also want to thank my many funders over the years who've supported the work that I'm up to. Make sure that I can use the slide. Okay, there we go. We'll use that. So I'm gonna start by giving just a little bit of background about what grandparent caregiving looks like in the US, particularly right now. I'm gonna skim through these stats because I think it's interesting, but given our time constraints, I like to get more into the heart of what we're discussing today. In 2024, about 2.5 million children were being raised in kinship or grand families in the US. In 2023, 2.1 million grandparents reported that they were primarily responsible for their grandchildren. The majority of these are in three-generation households, so 74%, while 26% are in the households that I study, skip-generation households. These point in time estimates are important, but they really still sort of under capture how prevalent grandparents are for grandchildren. And in the fact that 30% of children in the United States will live with their grandparent at some point. Again, primarily in multi-generation households, but 5% of those will be in skip generation households. African Americans are only 13% of the US population, but are overrepresented among grandparent-headed households. And it's come down over the years, but in um, uh, the most recent statistics, they were 20.2% of grandparent-headed households. Black children, and I would say grandparents, are more likely than other groups, with the exception of American Indian, Alaska Native families, to be raising children within skip generation households. 1 in 10 Black children will end up in these households, which is double the rate of the next number, which are Latinx children. Compared to other grandparents raising grandchildren, African American grandmothers are unique. One of the things that really strikes me about their experiences is that they're more likely than all other grandparents to be raising grandchildren without a parent living in the home, but also without a partner. So they're more likely to be doing this work alone in the sense of social support in that way. They tend to be younger. They tend to be more likely to be raising grandchildren at or below the federal poverty level, to be doing so in inner city neighborhoods. They tend to be raising more grandchildren, to be caring for them for a considerably longer period of time compared to the national average, and to be doing so with impaired health. So the questions that sort of guided my work around my book evolved over time. For most of us who write a book, we know that that is just the way that it shakes out. I'll share some of these questions with you, but obviously in the interest of time, I can only focus on a couple of them. But the first question was, why are largely poor Black women taking on surrogate parenting roles despite the gravity of their own personal struggles? So as a sociologist, I understand sort of the social context and structures and social problems that create these families, but what makes them feel like this is something that they want to or should be doing? What meanings and expectations do these women associate with the grandmother role? That is one that came later, and I'll share kind of why that is important. Why and how do these traditional grandmother roles morph into surrogate parenting roles? How do they manage the demands of caregiving, including their lack of legal rights, their challenges to making ends meet, and their inability to prioritize their own personal lives? And then finally, what challenges do today's Black grandmothers face that distinguish their caregiving experiences from those of their mothers and grandmothers, and why does that matter? So, one of the things that I argue in the book is that their experiences deviate from their historic counterparts in three significant ways. And before I even tell you what those ways are, I think it's important because some of what I hear when I tell people what I do, and I hear this from all groups, like it's whether it's the Black community, whether it's others who research Black grandmothers raising grandchildren, they tend to be overstudied compared to other groups raising grandchildren, is that, oh, Black grandmothers have always been doing this, as if to say there isn't anything more to learn about their experiences, and also as if to say their experiences are just sort of this long continuation of grandparent caregiving, and then therefore, you know, again, what else is there to really interrogate? And one of the things that I push back and say is that, yes, indeed, African American women have played a much more involved role in their grandchildren's lives compared to others. Um, but they haven't been doing this. They haven't been doing the caregiving that we see today in the 21st century. And one of the things that really supported that question, and it was an evolving question once I got into the field, is like, here were women who were coming from generations of women who had stepped in and raised their grandchildren. Some of them had been raised by their grandmothers temporarily or over the entire lives, um, who were, historically, we think about Black grandmothers as playing a much more parent-like role. Here were women who had all of those experiences, and yet they were feeling like they were having a fundamentally different experience than the one that they were expecting to have. What is happening, right? And so, three different things distinguish their experiences. Their grandchildren's circumstances have significantly changed compared to their historic counterparts. They confront an increased demand to legalize this relationship with their grandchildren, and they also must manage the threat of their grandchildren ending up in the child welfare system. These differences have implications not only for why they must step in to raise their grandchildren, but how they step in to raise their grandchildren. So when I say that it's sort of like, here were women who were having this experience that was different than what they even expected to have. They were like, yeah, my teenage daughter had a child, and yet I expected to be able to sort of apprentice her into mothering her child and so on and so forth. This was not it. I didn't expect her to walk off and leave her child with me. I didn't expect that. So I had to kind of step back and say, okay, what were your expectations for grandmotherhood? As if, which is, again, it sounds like a really basic question, but this is something that we just kind of make assumptions about with respect to Black elder women or middle-aged women. What were you expecting this role to look like? What does it mean to you to be a grandmother? And it was in asking that question that gave me the sort of first subtitle of my book. Well, actually, the second. So love, you can only, I say this all the time, like only love could do this, right? Like that you deeply love your grandchildren. And of course, you're going to step in and do what you need to do to ensure their safety and well-being. And yet, there was something else that was happening coercion, right? And so it asking that question allowed me to get at the coercive nature and dynamics that they face in having to step in, even when, frankly, they don't want to. So again, only love could do it. And then how do they show that love beyond their caregiving contributions? And so I wanted to sort of unpack that. And I found that they do it in several ways. They were prepared and they do particularly, I think it was great to have grandmothers in the study. Many who have grandchildren they're not raising. They're not raising all of their grandchildren. So what were their experiences like, with those other grandchildren? And again, what does grandmothering look like for them or mean to them? So it looked like prioritizing their grandchildren, protecting their grandchildren, nurturing their grandchildren as part of their lineage, equipping them with the tools they need to achieve success. Sorry, a second. Um, I can also get into more of my data during the Q&A if you all are interested in talking more about it. So sort of what their role expectations, what their role enactment looks like. And so one of the things that I came up with in asking this question of what were their expectations is this concept of anticipatory responsibility. And it's the expectation held among grandmothers and the Black community of a sense of duty to and accountability for their grandchildren's well-being. And to be clear, that does not necessarily mean raising their grandchildren. It just means that they are, like parents, responsible for them in a particular kind of way. So this is a table from my book where I sort of create this uh, table of like Black grandmotherhood role meaning, like what it means for them. And so we see prioritization means centering the child, regardless of one's own personal needs or wants. Like I may not want my grandchild here all the time, but I'm going to prioritize my grandchild. They come first, whether that's with the parent or even with respect to the foster care system. How that ends up being actualized is ensuring that their grandchildren have their basic needs met. And by that, not just material, but emotional, educational, spiritual, and fulfilling varying degrees of grandchildren's wants when they could. The protective function of meaning in terms of actualizing the grandmother role was about sheltering their grandchildren from harm, keeping them safe, especially from child maltreatment, even if that meant going against the parent to do that. And what that looked like in terms of actualization was eliminating the child welfare system as a threat, and removing grandchildren from individual environments where their well-being was, where their safety and well-being was threatened. And then nurturing them as part of their lineage. This was a really interesting one to me because a lot of women talked about family obligation. They stressed the biological relationship that they have with their grandchildren, keeping their families intact. This is my blood. I need to make sure that, they're not scattered out there and I not know where they are. And then how that looked like was caring for them, similar to how they cared for their own children. Raising siblings together was an important one, keeping their family together. And then leaving a legacy. So some grandmothers talked about that their grandchildren were part of their legacy and they felt like they needed to contribute to their accomplishments. And so they were really preoccupied with making sure that their grandkids had the tools they needed for external success. And that included providing educational opportunities, spiritual and psychological development, and cultural capital. Checking for time. Hey, doing good. All right, matters. So just an example of what it looked like to prioritize one's grandchild. This is Bobby Joe. She's 54. When her son went off to college, he ended up having a child, not getting married, but having a child. And she said, I stepped in because I wanted him to finish school. She was among several grandmothers that I interviewed who cared for their grandchildren so that parents could complete high school or college. And she says, because for one thing, they needed my help, and I wanted her granddaughter, to have a good life. I wanted her to enjoy everything that her son, did and more. I felt that the only way that that was going to be done is if I took care of her. That may be a little selfish, but I just felt if I would have been that, if it would have been that she would have been with them, she would not have had an enriched life. And I was able to provide for her. And I don't mean financial wise, I'm talking about emotional wise. And the love and the care that she gets from me. She feels secure and spoiled, don't get me wrong. So again, her rationale speaks to anticipatory responsibility. They needed my help and the meaning she attached to grandmotherhood. I wanted her to enjoy everything that he did and more, and how that influenced her decision. She'd been raising her granddaughter since birth, and she was 12 at the time of the interview. A really good example of the protective function is 38-year-old Victoria, who had three daughters, um, and was raising her newborn, 60-month-old grandchild at the time of the interview. And one of her daughters, who ended up with the child, um, she began to share with her mom that while she was working and co-parenting with the father, that he was not taking care of her the way that he should have been. In fact, he ended up leaving her in the care of his 8-year-old sister. And that is when the grandmother was like, absolutely not. And so one of the things that she says is, so I keep Nia because I think the environment at my house is safer and better for her. Because my daughter's working and she has to leave the baby there with the father, and I don't think he takes care of her like he should. And so when I asked her, um, what makes you feel like this is something you should do? She says, I don't feel like it's something I'm supposed to do. I just kind of feel like if I didn't keep Nia, that she would kind of be unsafe where she is. And my thing is, I don't want something to happen. I don't want her to be a statistic before she's a person. Because how you think of statistics, you can just rattle those off, and it's like you don't have any memory or mention of it anymore. Whereas a person you have memories of. So again, here's this sense of anticipatory responsibility around providing parental support. But again, it doesn't mean for every grandmother that I'm going to take over your parenting responsibilities. I'm going to help you out, but I'm not going to assume those responsibilities. A really great example of a grandmother demonstrating love as a function of grandmotherhood was Otha, who's 68 years old, who felt like keeping her family together was really important to her. Her daughter died suddenly from cancer. She was 59 years old when her daughter died, and she said the baby just made 2 weeks before she passed, and the other one was 4. She was 40. She had lung cancer. She went in the hospital on a Sunday and she died on a Tuesday. And so one of the things that, she talked about how she went to the public aid office and people were telling her she was too old. And she was just like, she had plans for her life. She talked about retiring and living near her sister and so on and so forth in a senior high rise. And she said, I didn't want none of my grandkids that I know of out there and I not know where they are. I know they're my grandchildren, but it's like they're mine. I know who I'm raising, but that's just the way I feel like inside. It's like I'm raising my own. I mean, because it has to be something you really want to do. It can't be nothing that you feel obligated to do because it will hurt you really bad because you'll be frustrated and depressed and everything. Because I did have a choice. I didn't have to keep them. I said, well, what made it feel like it was something you wanted to do? She said, I didn't want my family just scattered all around and I not know where they are. So, again, sort of keeping the family together was a driving force in the decision to step in and raise another generation. And then lastly, the sort of leaving a legacy and seeing their grandchildren as part of their legacy. 58-year-old Beulah exemplified this really well when she stepped in to raise two of her grandchildren when their mother would not enroll them in early child education programs. And she says, one of her big things was um, she felt like she leaving her legacy was about plugging her grandchildren into services, including early education, after school care, private school programs, therapy, individualized education programs, medical care, and so on. And she says, I strongly bring in a lot of services with Mahogany and Brayton and give them tools. I use tools to say to them, hey, you can call your uncle or you can go to your mama's house, go, 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 to let them know, don't rely on grandmother. And she talked about how giving them these tools was demonstrating to them, this is how you are supposed to be being raised. These are the things that mom have to do that need to be in place to make sure that you have a secure, safe, and better life. So again, grandmother's experiences today have changed significantly. One of the big things is the support needs of the parent generation have changed. We know, those of us who are here, there are unprecedented socio-demographic trends, not just in the United States, but globally. You have increasing life expectancy, declining marriage, increase in single parenthood, rising divorce rates, declining birth rates, all have caused shifts in family life and an increase the need for grandparents to be involved with their grandchildren. And this is regardless of race and ethnicity. However, the African American community here has been harder hit by some of these trends than other groups. So, for instance, between 1960 and 1980, the number of Black children living with a single parent increased from 9.9 to 20.5% compared to 5.1 to 7.1% for white children. In 2017, 65% of Black children were being raised by a single parent compared to 24% of white children. So, those kinds of trends have made a big difference. The same with respect to social problems have changed, right? We're dealing with drug epidemics, mass incarceration, HIV, AIDS, underemployment, unemployment, affordable housing, childcare, all those sorts of things. Again, these are things that are happening to everybody, but African Americans have been harder hit by many of them. And then changes to social welfare policies. So, welfare reform has been a big one, and the sort of increased use of kinship caregivers by the state. Another big difference is that, my mom stepped in to raise a niece and some of my nephews, and she could do that relatively informally, right? You could get your grandchild back in the day, you could get him or her enrolled in school, you could do all of these things without having paper, right? Or legal authority or demonstration of legal authority to do them. But today they confront an increased demand to legalize this relationship in ways that previous generations just haven't. So one, there's the child welfare system's increased reliance on grandparents as primary caregivers. Um, in 2007, when I started data collection for the work that I'm talking about, 24% of children in foster care nationwide were in relative or kinship foster care. In 2019, that number had risen to 32%. In 2020, kinship care accounted for 57% of Illinois' total foster care population. So there are several states within the US where the majority of the people caring for children who have come into contact with the child welfare system are relatives. And so when you're raising grandchildren inside of the child welfare system, there is an automatic sort of like breakdown and demand for some kind of legalization of that relationship, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So that is a very real thing. Child rearing institutions have increased the need for proof of legal rights. So, there's been a big changes in consent in terms of taking children to get medical care and being asked, do you have legal authority to have this child, make medical decisions on behalf of the child has definitely changed. As same with respect to education, like getting kids enrolled in school. And there are school or educational and medical care waivers that grandparents can get. But one, they need to know that that exists. Two, educational and healthcare consent laws vary depending on what state you're in. In 2019, only 24 states had both educational and healthcare consent laws. And again, there are ways around that. And again, it's knowing what those ways around that are, and whether they're going to be effective in any given circumstance. And then lastly, grandparents are using what legal guardianship as a form of private child protection in a way that I think is really important to look at. And I'm really thankful for some of the folks who are starting to do more of that work. And so, because grandparents don't have inherent rights to children, only parents and the state do. Um, when children are not safe wherever they are, or even if a parent is sick or whatever the circumstances are, how do you keep that child safe? How do you get what legal rights you can get? It is largely legal guardianship. It's called different things depending on where you are. And they're using it as a form of private child protection in a way that is pretty unprecedented as well. Black grandmothers also have to manage the threat of the child welfare system in ways that previous generations did not. So you could talk at length about how African Americans were largely excluded from the formal child welfare system. And then when they were given services, they were given segregated services and so on and so forth. This is the work of my mentor, Dorothy Roberts, talks about this quite a bit in her work. And so the culture and the idea that like my grandbaby could end up in the system is very real threat, whether it's happened or not. You can't be African American in the United States and not have and be a grandparent and not have that somewhere on your radar, that that's a very real reality for your grandchildren potentially. Over 50% of Black kids in the US will experience a child welfare investigation before their 18th birthday. That is a huge difference from their Black grandmothers today's historic counterparts. And 10% will be removed from their parents and placed into foster care. And that's double the rate of white children. 1 in 41 Black kids will have their relationship with their parents legally terminated. Oh, and that's more than double the rate of the general population. And, again, these numbers are also equally high for American Indian and Alaska Native children. Why does this matter? So it matters, one, because the systemic nature of social problems impacts the caregiving experience. So a lot of the social problems that I've talked about, um, they're not going to be resolved overnight, right? And so hence then you get grandmothers who are raising grandchildren under much tougher circumstances, right? And for much longer periods of time. And what I also found about this that makes it really interesting and why it matters is that some of these social problems will cause conflict between the parent and the grandparents in a way that was unexpected, especially when parents are unwilling to relinquish custody of children that they can't adequately care for. So if you're talking about a parent that's dealing with a substance addiction, untreated mental health issues, and so on and so forth, those are different kinds of dynamics that get created. Secondly, the increased demand to legalize their relationship with their grandchildren changes the form and tenor of informal grandparent caregiving. So, one of the things that I found in doing this research is that this idea of informal caregiving sort of covers over a lot of nuance within that category. So, yes, there's like private kinship care, right, where you just informally make this arrangement with the parent and the parent gets themselves together or so on and so forth, and then they end up back with their child. But then there is what I found to be this sort of um, uh, other category, again, of legal guardianship where it's like, I can't just keep this relationship private, even if I want to. And that could come about from all kinds of different things, but I use in the book that there is within this category of informal care, take versus keep. And this is their language. I'm just keeping my grandbaby often looks like private kinship care. I got to take my grandbaby often looks like using what little legal recourse and pathway they have to do that, which is often legal guardianship. So that's a big difference. Um, and then lastly, because of African American families involvement with the child welfare system, it forces grandmothers to manage external state intervention. And what I call external state intervention is that Black children are much more likely to have the child welfare system brought in by, um, what do you call them? Mandatory reporters, right, than other children. So those families are given less benefit of the doubt around whatever circumstances there are, whether it's teachers, emergency room workers, and so on and so forth. And so, if they're calling the child protective system on parents, then grandmothers are then having to manage that call that comes in the middle of the night or the day where my grandbaby, the call is get your grandbaby now, or they're going to go to non-relative foster care, right? And so they're having to manage that in a very, in a much a more at a much more alarming rate. and it changes the complexity of the caregiving arrangement, which I'm going to get into in a minute, and then sort of pushes them into involvement with the child welfare system. All right, for Tom. Yes. Okay. All right. So this table, when I talk about how their experiences differ significantly and the sort of way that caregiving, the caregiving types vary so much today they compared to their historic counterparts. So there's private kinship care, which the vast majority of caregivers are raising their grandchildren in private kinship care or informal kinship care. But I went to the great length to look and see grandparents are navigating a whole different landscape of kinship care arrangements. I mean, to the point that this table in my book took back and forth between me and a senior scholar in the field. I'm going to speak his name. He is just one of the most amazing humans, but he studied this for a long time and he reviewed my book for the University of California Press. Thank you, Jim Gleason. University of Illinois, Chicago. School of Social Work. He's been on the ground in Chicago working with these families for his entire career. He's retired now, but we went back and forth to get this table right. When the child welfare system gets involved, when grandmothers themselves go outside and get legal guardianship, it changes so much about the role of the state in the caregiving arrangement. Is it mandated as through the child welfare system? Their legal rights, are their legal rights reversible? Do they have any? The resources that come with those caregiving arrangements looks significantly different. People who are providing care outside of the child welfare system are then sort of relegated to social safety net programs, TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, the welfare system essentially, and versus getting foster care payments through the child welfare system. The services that those kids get looks very different depending on where they are in this sort of what I call a five-tiered system of kinship care. The screening and assessment of the caregiver prior to placement vary significantly. Does the child welfare system come to your home to make sure that it's safe, that your grandchildren can be there? Or is the child welfare system out of your business and you make whatever decisions you need to make about your grandchild being in your care? And then the sort of ongoing review and placement of the children looks different. Are you getting a monthly caseworker visit or is the child welfare system not involved? So we have state mandated care, and that's everything around the child welfare system of licensed kinship, foster care, subsidized guardianship, adoption. I was interviewing women who were like still themselves trying to understand what care type am I in? What does that mean for what legal rights I have, the rights parents have, the resources I'm entitled to, and so on. And if this is overwhelming for us, imagine under difficult circumstances having to make a decision, one, about whether to do it, two, about then how do I do it and what are my options. It's a maze. And then we've got state mediated care where we got legal guardianship and private adoption, and then you've got uh, state independent where it's again private or independent um, caregiving arrangements. So whole sort of different experience with respect to even the kind of structure that grandmothers have to create and operate inside of to do the care work. So one of the things I love about studying this was like, before we can get to the day-to-day care, I've got to talk about what it means to even create the structure to do that care. So, Grandmothering While Black challenges the common belief that contemporary grandparent caregiving is merely a continuation of historic tradition in the Black community. Black grandparents haven't always experienced caregiving in its current iteration. And by not acknowledging these complexities and hardships, it erases the magnitude of their caring labor. It denies them and their families of the resources and supports they so desperately need. Thank you so much. And I can talk about my other projects in the Q&A if anyone is interested. I will stop my screen share.
Well, I am so interested and can key off that question, but thank you. Two amazing talks. They felt so well together. I'm so grateful for your research, both of you. And I do want to open up the floor to other people's questions. If you type your questions in the chat for the webinar, I should be able to see them and read them out. But while that's populating, Dr. Pittman, why don't you talk some more about your research ongoing, your new projects?
Yeah, so one project that I'm excited about, well, I'm excited about all of them, that's why I'm doing them, but like the the one that I would say kind of came first was when I was in the field collecting data, one of the things that I noticed was the poor health of many of the women that I was interviewing. And so I made it a note in my brain that I was going to come back around to that. So one project that I am working on is a stress reduction intervention rather, for kinship caregivers. And so it's one that sort of has been fits and starts, and I've worked with some amazing folks. I have an incredible team. We're finishing up our last grant for it, where we're doing all of this sort of initial work to create this intervention. So I'm working with Dr. Wadia Udell, who's a developmental psychologist and an interventionist, and really importantly um, to me is that we have three folks on our research team who are community members who are working directly with this population. They have been for decades, and some of them have personal experience with it. And so, one of the things that we plan to do in reducing stress is to target some of the unique stressors that these caregivers face, like the legal stuff I'm talking about, like dealing with parents, like dealing with developmental needs of children and generational differences, but also, really importantly, the financial stress. And so, that's something that's novel and I think is important. Another thing that came out of this work, which is really interesting to me, which is this sort of question of like, they've always been doing this. And I'm like, well, what does Black grandmotherhood look like historically? So my next book is going to be the first book, I don't know, unless somebody else does it before me, which is totally possible, that actually uses empirical research and oral histories and firsthand accounts to look at Black grandmothering from pre-colonial West Africa through the Great Migration. And then as I was gathering these stories, I realized just how incredibly important they are, and like, why isn't there a place where we are gathering this knowledge, this wisdom, these experiences? And so hence the archival projects have come about. And so I have some grants right now that I'm using to gather the stories of Black grandmothers and preserve them. So those are my three working projects.
That's just amazing. I'm so glad that you're doing the historical research too, right? Because I'm so interested in your talk about how history gets used to reinforce this idea that Black women are always going to hold everything together, right? And I guess for both of you, Juanita, you looking at new media, and, LaShawnDa, you doing these interviews, I'd love to hear more about how these grandmothers find maybe some kind of mutual care where they have a sense that someone's caring for them. And I was so moved by Bobby Joe talking about the enriched life, not, maybe not financial, but emotional, that she was
Mhm.
giving to her grandchild. And so, do these women, for either of you, talk about how they find that enriched life for themselves, or create it?
I'm gonna let Juanita go. Unless you don't want to, no pressure.
Did you repeat the question again, Corinne? I'm sorry.
Or who's taking care of these women? How are they finding moments of self-care? Yeah, I'm thinking a bit of Trisha Hershey's nap ministry and the rest is resistance. Where are these women finding moments of rest and care, if at all?
Um, for the women that are publicly talking about menopause, a lot of them, it's a really nice podcasting community of Black women who are concentrating their podcast solely on menopause and building community. And there's one lady, Omasade Bernice Scott, who actually had a conference just strictly about menopause for Black women. I didn't get to attend the conference, but someone I know attended. And so they're building communities that way. And they're also really working hard. It's very interesting. What is a very common theme is that our mothers prepared us for our menstrual cycles, but they did not talk to us about menopause. And so, how can we start talking to young ladies, those of us who are going through or have been through menopause? How can we purposely not repeat that and prepare the younger generation of women for menopause? So that's one, and there's a lot of energy around that, and that's really seems to be able to, it's helping them, the actual menopausal woman, too.
And I'll throw into that one of the things that there have been some scholars who've studied this that found that many of the women that they interviewed, or even in larger samples, talk about not having enough social support. I don't think there's ever enough, but what I find is that for the women I interviewed, they were also saying they didn't have support, but what I came to see was that they had social support, but what they really were honing in on is the buck stops with me. I'm the only one whose life has changed fundamentally because I have assumed this caregiving responsibility. The parents sometimes go and have more kids. My partner still gets to go do whatever he's doing. Everybody's life has changed. And we all know that children tether you to the home, right? And so, one of the things I found in thinking about like what people don't think about, like what to Juanita's point, what do these women want for themselves beyond caregiving? We don't even like to think about older Black women as wanting anything else. And it's like what I found among all these sort of like once I kind of analyzed all the data is that they wanted freedom. They wanted to be able to go when they want to go and do what they want to do because they feel like they've earned it, right? Many were counting down to when their children were out of the house. Some were counting down to when they could sell their homes and move to a senior high rise. And so freedom was sort of the overarching theme. And one of the things I walked away with is that while these women had social support, help with the grandchildren, what people weren't thinking about was giving your mama a break just to go get her hair done, to, you know, go to church, do all the things that really feed them and that they value. And I also say with my work over the various places where I've lived and right now here in Seattle is that the kinship support group networks are important. Like I find that the grandmothers who have fared the best um, attend those groups and they have that peer support and are talking to women who are going through what they're going through and not feeling like, bad about sharing how they really feel about their experiences. And so that's been a really important space, I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, there's a question from Dara Walker, who I want to call out is herself doing amazing research on older Black women in the Black Power and civil rights movements. So keep an eye out for that. Dr. Walker asks, Dr. Pittman, did you find any similarities or differences in how different generations of grandmothers approach the state and grandmothering itself, i.e., grandmothers in their 30s and versus 50s versus 70s?
That is a really great question. And I just wrote your name down, so I will be looking out for that work. Um, e- Generational differences around the state. That is interesting. I didn't look at generational differences. I looked at like how were people managing their relationship with the state because by and large, and I don't want to make too much of a blanket statement, we don't trust the state. The child welfare system comes in hot and heavy. It is a punitive system within the Black community, period. And yet sometimes we have to use that actual system to keep our grandchildren safe. And so it's this weird sort of mix. And so I found that I talk about it in my book as you have some that accommodate where they are often accommodating of what the child welfare system is coming in with because they agree with it. You have some that resist. And like, you ain't telling me what to do in my house. Now you think you are telling me what to do in my house, but when you leave, I'm doing what I want to do in my house. And then you have some that sort of maximize that relationship. How do I use the resources of the state to help my child get on their feet, her feet largely, it's mothers, so they can get their own kids back. And so it's interesting to see sort of how they respond in those ways. But I would say kind of one thing I would say across the generations is that the distrust largely of the state is warranted and was experienced across the generations. And even when women use the state, because there were women who call CPS themselves on their children at times, they were very thoughtful about what that meant, what the implications of that were. They took the time to find safe spaces to go and talk about what was really happening. How much do I share to get what I need, but not overshare so that my grandkids aren't taken. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Oh, wow. Um, Juanita, you were next in the chat, but would you like to just ask your question in your own words?
Yes, Dr. Pittman, I was wondering about the support from other extended family members, like the aunts or the uncles, even though the grandma is the buck stops with them. Any comments about support from other relatives of those children?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. So first I'll say I want to give a shout out to the men. People often say, where are the granddaddies? And I'm like, I'm a granddaddy's girl. So, it's like if there were men in these women's lives, they were the primary source of support. So I want to like that's important, right? Many who had partners, when their partners were present, they were helping with those kids. And, so that's the role of Black men in caregiving, is important and important to acknowledge and interesting as a topic of study. So I would say that is the first thing. When parents were able and they were healthy enough, they were they were doing certain things for those kids. So they were sometimes doing the laundry, making sure their mothers didn't have to do that. And my chapter on economic survival strategies, some grandmothers were able to share resources with parents in order to care for those kids. And then I would say, one of the things we talk about around sort of like younger single mothers are often lacking the social support that they need in ways that haven't been appreciated. This is Kathy Eden's work, Laura Lean. Um, but for the older women, what I find is that we tend to have more seasoned social support networks, right? Their kids are grown, right? So if it's not the parent, those kids, and you have other kids, and when those other kids were around or even not around, they were helping financially. They were helping with childcare when they could. They have siblings who were involved. Some were young enough to still have their mothers involved, and so they had really rich, seasoned support networks, which is really important to acknowledge those, to talk about those, and the complex ways that they provide that support is really important. I think the only thing that I would add again is that these women still have personal needs that need to be supported. And it's not just the support around the caregiving role, but it's like, I'm still a woman, a whole being, that this is not every aspect of who I am.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, I know we're slamming into time, but let me try to get in one more question from Dr. June Oh, who I just heard give a great paper on grandfluencers. So definitely follow her work as well. So she said that she was intrigued with the interviews you did with the grandmothers, Dr. Pittman, and I wonder if you had a chance to trace how their ideas shift as they age. Slightly different twist on Dara's question. Circumstances change with their own well-being, health, their relationships with their adult children change. Do you see anything significant there?
I love a good question that makes me think. Um, I've not been able to trace how their ideas change, the women that I interviewed particularly. But what I have been able to do because of my continued involvement with this community is I'm thinking about sort of the trajectory of the caregiving experience across the women in my book, the women that I'm involved with here in Seattle and other places where I've been. And what I've found in terms of just sort of the processing of the experience, right? And so initially this was not what I was expecting. And that could look like any number of things. It is grief, it is anger, um, it is a shift in like what I was planning for myself. Like there was a grandmother that I just did a self-care retreat about a month ago for a group of grandmothers here in Seattle, and one of them had just gotten her master's degree, and she talked about it as hanging on the wall. Now it's like art, you know? And so I find that like that starts dissipating
Mm. Mm.
as parents reveal themselves in terms of what is happening with them. Is it really possible that they're going to get this kid back? That starts shifting over the caregiving experience. Some accept it's probably not going to happen. Some say, I'm not waiting for it to happen. You're not keeping me in limbo. I'm
Mm.
going to get legal guardianship. This is my child now. Even though legally it's not, but they use again. Um, so I think that their relationship to the caregiving, assumption of caregiving shifts. I think they begin to sort of become a little bit more realistic about what may or may not happen with that parent shifts. And then I think something unexpected happens. And I think this is a great way to end their care shifts. This is care work for a reason. Their hearts shift. They're like, oh, this is my child now. I love my grandbaby. Now I can't imagine my life without my grandbaby here. They get me up in the morning. And so I think, the heart does things, and to be clear, these grandmothers prioritize the parent-child relationship. They feel like the healthiest thing for their family, for these kids, for their children, is for those kids to be with their parents when they can care for them. If that can't happen, they're the next best thing. And yet, giving them back can be hard. After the longer they're in it, especially when they've developed deeper ties. In some cases, it's the best relationship they've ever had, by the time it's all said and done. So I think those are three different places where I see a change over the life course of the care experience.
That is such a beautiful place to end. I will also say I look forward to Juanita's work on how peri-menopause, post-menopause changes emotional and spiritual strategies. So this is just the start of great research. I hope great conversations. I want to thank you so much for presenting to both of you, and thanks to everyone for being here. Keep your eye open. We will be doing these intersectional age seminars again next year. I know in October we'll have one on the history of Indigenous elders in California. And so keep an eye out for that. And thanks to Julia and Jamie for hosting, Yuan for helping with organizing this. Thanks
Thank you,
all.
everybody. Thanks for spending some time today.